Today we're thrilled to be speaking with the Reverend Wesley Granberg-Michaelson. Reverend Granberg-Michaelson served as General Secretary of the Reformed Church in America for 17 years from 1994 to 2011, and before this held the position of Director of Church and Society at the World Council of Churches in Geneva. The Reverend Granberg-Michaelson participated in the founding of several ecumenical platforms, including Christian Churches Together in the USA and the Global Christian Forum. He is the author of several books, and we've had the privilege of speaking with him on this program in earlier episodes. He's written, for example, Unexpected Destinations, An Evangelical Pilgrimage to World Christianity in 2011, Without Oars, Casting Off into a Life of Pilgrimage, published in 2020, and today we'll be speaking with Reverend Granberg-Michaelson about his latest book, The Soulwork of Justice, Four Movements of Contemplative Action, published in 2025. Reverend Granberg-Michaelson, we're so grateful to be speaking with you today.
It's great to be with you, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the work you do and have had a long time of real gratitude for your ministry and our relationship.
Praise God. It's mutual, sir. You're calling from Santa Fe today, is that correct?
That's right.
How long have you been living in Santa Fe? And I think you moved there in retirement.
I mean, I think retirement means I do the things I used to do, except I don't get paid.
Yes, sir.
We moved here, and you can just call me Wes. We moved here 10, almost now 11 years ago, and it was really, we've been in Michigan, and I've been working with the Reformed Church for many years, and we felt a move like this was part of what God might have for us in order to open a new chapter. It's really the way we looked at it, and it's really proven to be true. Thank God. It's many new opportunities have come, and both right now, my wife and I are doing interim pastorate. We're helping a small evangelical Lutheran church here. So I'm preaching and she's preaching, like every other Sunday, doing pastoral calling and caring for just a small but precious flock of people of God. And that's the kind of opportunity we never really imagined in so-called retirement. So we're grateful to God.
So beautiful. In the very last page of your book, you give such an appetizing endorsement for a cafe, a French cafe in Santa Fe. I've never been to Santa Fe, but I started wanting to go to Santa Fe after I read your endorsement of this particular French cafe where you did much of your writing. It sounds like a great place to be
It's
working.
a great place. The owners become a friend. I gave him a copy of the book. He says he's looking at it in between times when he cooks. So we'll see.
Nice. I'd like to dive straight into your book. This is a book that I read slowly because it's a book I needed to read. Sometimes we read books we have to read. Sometimes we get to read books we need to read. And this was the latter experience for me. So I read it slowly. And first of all, for those of us who are tuning into this conversation, I want to take just a minute to help them understand what this title means. Soul work. That's a word that, as far as I can tell, you wordsmithed. Perhaps others use it too. But let me just do a little reading from the very first chapter to get into our minds what we're talking about with this concept, the soul work of justice. And I'm going to turn us to page 5, 2 paragraphs. At the bottom of page 5, you write this. In the end, if your inward and outward journey become interwoven, your life and witness will have the opportunity to flourish. But if they are alienated from each other, and your inward journey is neglected or rejected, your outward journey, regardless of the intensity of your commitment, eventually will start to disintegrate with self-inflicting wounds that are likely to badly injure others and undermine the causes which you have committed your lives. And then I'm going to continue reading on the middle of page 8. You write this. Honestly, this won't be easy. You're going up against evil every day, monstrous evil, overwhelmingly present for all to see, and subtle evil embedded within the efficient and self-justifying institutions claiming our temporal allegiance. All that takes a toll because we're fighting not just against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and rulers of darkness. Our movements for social transformation require political actions and economic strategies. But at the heart of it all, they require a spiritual engagement that can only be met by an inward journey that is integrated with our outward mission. You've been working in this space between political engagement and theological reflection really for all of your career. When did you decide to write this book?
Jonathan, I decided to write this during COVID, and it was after my wife and I were sitting in the living room, and for most of my journey as an adult Christian, I've kept a journal of my own internal life and spiritual walk with God and the things I encounter in my reflections. So I had all these journals on the shelf. And my wife, Karen, turned to me and said, "What are you ever going to do with those?" And I said, "I have no idea." And she said, "Well, why don't you read them through and see if there's anything in there that we could pass on to our two kids?" So I started rereading these. It took a year. And I would cull out things that I thought were important. And by the time I ended that, I had a thick book that I was going to give to our two kids at Christmas. Uh, but I felt there's a lot here that I think is resonating with others and that has some wisdom to share. And at that same time, I was looking at what was happening in our country and seeing a lot of my friends and colleagues involved in deep activism working for God's justice. That's kind of the world, I've lived in, even though I was raised as a very strong conservative evangelical. I've been in that world of activism and ecumenism and working for justice, but I felt, you know, if if folks don't have the inner spiritual grounding that's so essential. They're going to burn out. They're going to become just as angry as the people they're angry at. They're going to demonize their opponents. And it's not really going to work for what God desires and how Jesus asks us to try to engage. And those two things came together. And I said, well, maybe I should try to put some of this down. And then I talked to an agent, a friend who's worked with my previous books. I shared this idea with her, and she turned to me and said, "You have to write this." And that's how it started, Jonathan.
The seed began to grow in 2020 during the COVID crisis. I think I can pretty fairly say this book has become more necessary in the last 5 years, not less necessary.
Yeah.
And it's really, I took it as a manual for those of us who are or want to get going in activist work. And there's a soul work component to that. We can't just do this in our own or we'll burn out. There's a spiritual component that we need to get right for sustainability of these efforts. In chapter one, you give us some survival skills that we're going to have to learn. You enumerate them: learning to pray, getting away, exploring who you are, journaling, don't go it alone, and worship.
Hmm.
Which of these skills was perhaps the hardest for you to learn?
Journaling. Uh, I and then the second one was retreat. Um, I was part of a church community called Church of the Savior early in my career when I was in Washington, D.C. I was working for Senator Mark Hatfield. He was a strong evangelical and happened to be a Republican, but very much against the Vietnam War. And he was he was what you called back then a liberal Republican. That has since become an extinct species. But he, I wanted to work with him. I was really busy, but I needed an inner grounding spiritually. I needed to find a church home. And Church of the Savior is a place that really taught that you have to have an inward and outward journey integrated together. Exactly what you read from that portion, which I wrote maybe 45, 50 years later. Um, and in that inward journey, one of the tools that they used was journaling. And I had never done that in my own Christian piety. I mean, I knew how to have a quiet time, read the Bible, but this was a new tool. Um, and it began to be that place, Jonathan, where I could process the pain and the grace in my life. And I think that's what we all need. Now, different people will find different tools. Nothing is right for everybody. this was right for me. And then with it came retreat, and not just, I was in my evangelical upbringing, and retreat meant going away and having a lot of fun with kids and hearing a talk once in a while. Well, here retreat was learning how to be silent before God, learning how to really open yourself in a deeper way to God's presence that uh, asked you to be still and asked you to be quiet and asked you to listen. I went on this first retreat. I'd been working a busy day on Capitol Hill and drove out to Dayspring Retreat Farm to join this retreat I had somehow signed up for. Walked into a dinner, and everyone was there in silence, eating in silence. And, we were going to be in silence for a weekend with a few, interventions, a few times of sharing. And I was petrified. I'd never done anything like this in my life. And I discovered silence became a friend, became a way in which I can be open more deeply to God's presence. So I would say those of that list, those two were the most difficult for me. But in the long run, I think they've been maybe the most rewarding.
A space to process pain and grace. That's such a beautiful way to explain that. Journaling was hard for you to learn, but you have a massive journal. So wait a minute, if that was the hard one to learn, then and some of the journal entries that you incorporate in the book, you're very young. You're 27. You're 29. So you were not slow on the uptake with these spiritual disciplines. But talk to us about the form of the journal over the years. Do these volumes on your shelf look very different? Have they evolved
Yeah,
into different forms? What does that physical
yeah, they
journal actually
have.
look like?
I mean, they have. It's really interesting. All these things evolve. My journal now looks like this, and I'll write. Uh, not every day, but put down what if I'm listening to something, and I'm thinking about something, praying about something, and I just want to process it. Um, there were times when the journal became a really deep tool for my my inward spiritual life with Christ. And I would write voluminous pages. I mean, I have some really thick notebooks where I'd be writing 20 pages a day. Especially when there's a long story here, but I spent 5 weeks at a Trappist monastery, living with the monks in their own life, and that was a time when a lot was being processed in my spiritual journey with Christ, and I document that in the book. And during that time, I found journaling as just an indispensable way to try to deal with all the stuff that was going on. Then at other times, it might be, oh, just a few times a month, I may write a few words uh, and put things that I need to remember. But here's the interesting thing, Jonathan. I would try to go on at least a day retreat once a month, and then sometimes a longer retreat, like maybe a week or 3 or 4 days, whatever. But every time I would go on retreat, what I would find myself doing is reading the journal entries I'd written from the prior time when I'd been on retreat. And that became really helpful in just bringing to mind and bringing to my spirit the things that I'd been working with and dealing with. Um, I know my wife has sometimes said, the way you use a journal is the way other people use a therapist. And there might be some truth in that. But it's just it became a tool that was comfortable in helping me, as I say, really deal with the difficult things I encounter and deal with the unexpected grace from God that I encounter.
Journaling as a form of therapy, perhaps. What about journaling as a form of prayer?
Absolutely,
Is it
yeah.
different from prayer? What's going on there?
It's a great question. Um, I think, I'd probably say this. In the kind of evangelical world that I treasured and that I grew up with, prayer was all about words. I mean, I would, what I was doing was adding to God's to-do list, which was already pretty long. But, please do this, please do that. Oh, I'm worried about this. Please bring this. I mean, that's a really legitimate form of prayer. But what I learned is that prayer, at least for me, also became presence. It instead of asking, it became, how do I really open myself to God's presence? And and a lot less words. But then I found a lot of what I wanted to say in words, I would put in a journal. And so sometimes those journal entries were like a dialogue with God. Why did you do this? Why did this happen? Sometimes they were different. They were just, but there's a way in which I think, at least in my spiritual development, journaling was where a lot more words came. Prayer was a lot more presence evidenced.
I have not kept a journal nearly as long as yours, and the journaling that I have done has been audio format. I found that I don't
Hmm.
have very lovely handwriting, nor do I have the
Yep, yep.
patience to write, so I'll audio journal. And one of the things that has been that I can't answer, I keep coming back to this question of my own experience, my own abbreviated experience of journaling, is that I don't know who I'm talking to. I think I'm talking to God, but I'm not sure. Was that ever problematized in your own experience? The question of to whom are you addressing these thoughts?
Yeah. Um, sometimes I know I would be talking to myself, uh, trying to figure out what, you know, what I needed to learn or hear or understand. Um, Sometimes I'd be talking to someone else. In other words, there's sometimes in a real say I'm in some kind of really difficult relationship that has, a treasured relationship that's suddenly fallen apart. Might be with a work colleague, I mean, whatever. At times I'd write in a way that would be what I kind of was feeling and wanted to say. Um, but then at other times, for sure, I was just speaking to God and also just sharing the experience that I'd had where I had felt God's presence. I mean, that I would, that I'd be on a retreat and I'd take a long walk across a field and and things would break through. I would just experience a presence. I'd have an insight. I'd be overwhelmed by a flash of light and grace and and I tried to reflect and capture that. So I think that the question you ask is really good, and I'd say in my experience, it depends. My journal entries yeah, have gone in different directions, but I'd say in all of it, I'd feel I'm really being open and present to God, and with a lot of honesty. I don't know. Elizabeth O'Connor was member of Church of the Savior, and she wrote several books about Church of the Savior, including like Call to Commitment and Journey Inward, Journey Outward. Uh, Older books, but ones that are really worth reading. Um, she would say, I keep my journal, but every day, every night, I put my journal in the wastepaper basket. So if I die, no one will read it. And that's, so there's a dimension in which sometimes in your journaling, you really want to be honest with yourself and not necessarily writing something for your friends to read.
I thank you that you open up some of the pages of your journal in this book for us. And like you just alluded to in that past answer, there is a tinge of mysticism that shows up in your journal. Uh, Immediate experience of the presence of God, and to the reader, that's extremely interesting. And we could have a longer conversation about that too. Wes, if I may, in chapter 3, you introduce a very important concept for the later half of your book, and you call that uh, a holding space. And I think I need a little help to understand from you, or I've read your book carefully, but I think I should introduce the concept here for our listeners. What are you speaking of when you speak of a holding space, please?
Yeah. Um, you know, if if some of your readers are evangelical, I assume, or some of your listeners, I in the evangelical home I grew up, uh, I always had what we called a quiet time. A time where you'd pray and you'd read the Bible. I mean, but we you'd call it that. It was a good discipline. Um, in my own journey, I had to figure out how to enliven that in certain ways or refresh it and take different forms. But that was a hint, I think. By holding space, it's a term I came up with to describe essentially a spiritual infrastructure that you put into place that allows you to do three things. First of all, it's a place where, as I've already said, you can process the grace and the pain in your journey. A place where you can detach and process that, deal with it. And secondly, it's it's a place where you can try to sink deeper into the real truth of things, the truth of what confronts your life, the truth of the injustice, the reality in the world. And third, a place that allows you to center your attention, um, to center you in ways that bring you deeper than all the constant influx that's coming, especially from social media today. And so I speak of a holding space as putting together that infrastructure. And so how do you do that? Well, it depends. The things that you listed at the beginning of our interview are things that for me more or less are my holding space. It's journaling, it's retreat, it's centering in a specific time each day. It's also worship. It's being in a community, and those things together are the way in which I know I'm able to sort of get the proper kind of detachment that I need in order to be fully open to God's presence to my life, God's presence to those I encounter, and God's presence to the world.
Hmm.
Now, it's going to differ. Well, how you put that infrastructure together is going to be different for different people. I mean, it depends upon how you learn, depends upon probably your Myers-Briggs type. It might depend upon your Enneagram, might depend upon your past experience, etc. But you've got to do something because no one's going to do this for you. If you can't just let it slide, or you'll be overwhelmed by the pressures in the culture and the demands that you face in your daily life. So that's why I liked to talk about it as a holding space.
And if I can just ask a clarifying question there, holding space, this is a term that is unique to your work and literature. How is this different from a spiritual discipline?
Yeah, I mean, spiritual disciplines, I would say, are specific tools. Spiritual discipline, it may be a way of praying, it may be a way of retreat, it may be adopting how you interact with Scripture, maybe Lectio Divina, maybe, different ways of conducting those together. You could call those things together a spiritual discipline. I simply felt the term holding space is broader, and a holding space is that way in which different spiritual disciplines can be incorporated. Yes, it's just a term I came up with that I found helpful, and if others find it helpful, good, and if not, that's fine too. But that's what I was trying to get at, and I was trying to get at some fresh language, Jonathan, to
Hmm.
to help people think about what's really going on here. You need to have a space that's separate from what normally encompasses us and what normally comes at us You got to develop some separate space in order for that to happen. And extreme examples. I mean, you go to a monastery and you live your life praying 6 times a day and in silence and so forth. Well, that's for a very few group of people. But I think all of us need to figure out how do we, well, frankly, how do we take something like a monastery with us? How do we always have that place we can retreat to, a holding space?
And that is certainly the way I remember. I can't name the page, but you would describe it that way too, as a monastery within or a retreat
Mhm.
that you're
Yep,
bringing with you.
yep.
And for what it's worth, I got the idea as I'm not sure if I could justify it, but I got the idea as I was working through your book that this holding space is a place of reorientation, of redirection, of recentering. Sometimes the emphasis that we use when you speak of disciplines is an activity to do, and I think you were clearly choosing another emphasis.
Mhm.
Or we think of spiritual practice as something that's going to give us content, and you're not using those emphases or metaphors. You're speaking of this space of reorientation
Mhm.
and getting back to a correct perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
In the second part of your book, then, you describe four movements from self sufficiency to belonging, from certainty to connection, from grandiosity to authenticity, and lastly, from control to trust. And these are the movements that we need to be on, the directions we need to be going if we're going to be fulfilling and sustainably living God's calling for us as individuals. Let's talk about that first movement first, from self-sufficiency to belonging. It's in this part of the book that you describe this deep impact that your early retreat at Holy Cross Abbey near Berryville, Virginia had for you. Some of our listeners are never going to have visited a monastery. Why would anyone choose to get
Yeah.
away in this extreme way?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I know, like some of your listeners, first time I well, I can tell you how it happened. Um, so I'm working on Capitol Hill for Mark Hatfield. It's 1972. It's a very intense year. It happened to be a presidential year when George McGovern was running against Richard Nixon. McGovern and Hatfield, though Democrat and Republicans, were very close friends and had worked together against the Vietnam War. And Senator Hatfield was up for reelection that year. Well, by December, Nixon had won. He had not just beaten McGovern, he demolished him. He won 49 out of 50 states. Hatfield had won his reelection. I was sitting in my office in December, exhausted, totally depleted. And there was an index card on my desk that had a friend at Church of Savior had given me that had the number of the guest master at Holy Cross Monastery. And he had said to me, sometime, Wes, maybe you want to try going to this monastery. And I said, oh, yeah, maybe. So it was a rainy day. I was at my desk and I was thinking, I just got to get away. Maybe I'll call up a travel agent and go to the Virgin Islands or go someplace warm. I just need some. And then I saw this card and I kind of said, oh, well, maybe. I called it up and I hear, hello, this is Father Stephen. And I kind of said, well, what, I wonder, I wonder if I could ever come out there. And, and he said, as a guest, yeah, well, come right away. And I put down my phone and I said, well, the next day I got into my car and I drove to Berryville Monastery. I didn't know what I was doing. And I arrived there, so graciously received. And I entered into this process for 5 days, Jonathan, where the only way I could explain it is that I had these couple of experiences of being filled and embraced by God's love in light and in just precious moments of real breakthrough that frankly they changed the course of my life. I discovered experientially in a deeper way what I sort of thought I knew in my head. Um, and and I experienced it because I think of this. I was just in this space that was so new, so open, so fresh, so mysterious, so different that it allowed God to do more things in my life. And you can never program those things. You can never plan them. They come as a divine ambush once in a while, and all you can do is receive them. And that's really how it happened. And it then led me over a period of several months to joining the monastery. They had a program called Retreatant in Community. They would invite someone to come and live with them. And I talked to Senator Hatfield, so forth. It was in the spring. Senate was going to be on recess. And so I took 5 weeks off and I lived there. And it was during that time that I began to encounter some of the things that I later reflected in my journal, particularly this journey from self-sufficiency to belonging. I think I say in the book, I picked up a book by Karen Horney, who was a psychologist, writing a book called Self-Analysis, and she's writing about all these forms of, the things that create problems for us. And one of them said, narcissistic self-sufficiency. I read this paragraph and I suddenly said, oh my gosh, that's me. That's me. And that kind of began how, in my own life, I had to make a movement from thinking I was good unto myself, regardless of what I believed, theologically, that I could really do it, I could really achieve. I could be the one who could make anything happen. I didn't really need or depend upon deep relationships with others. Well, all that had to be deeply changed in order for me to proceed on the way that I think God desired.
I'm going to linger on that moment just for a minute, if you're willing to. When you described that experience in the monastery, I flipped back in the book. It's on page 68. It's December 15, 1972. You're 27 years old at the time of the writing of that journal. And how would you describe this experience? You call it a divine ambush just now.
Mhm.
Was it a filling of the Spirit? What was this? And I know that I don't think you describe this in your other books except for Without Oars. You can correct me. Maybe you have talked about this experience in some other your writings, but your last book too in 2020 was about pilgrimage. You spoke a lot about the importance of actual pilgrimage, actual monastery visits for your own spiritual journey. This was huge for you.
Yeah, it was. It was a pivotal moment in my life. And I think we all think about our spiritual journeys, and I think most of us can identify times when something happened in a way where we just knew the presence of God and the love of Jesus was more real than anything else we'd ever known. And I mean, if you're a Pentecostal, you're going to probably talk about that as being filled with the Spirit, a second conversion, whatever, and there'd be certain things that would come with it. If you're an evangelical, you might use the language of if not a second conversion, at least you would talk about when you fully committed yourself, through some encounter. But if you're in a more Catholic tradition, for instance, or just ecumenically in a more contemplative tradition, uh, you you would talk about a time when you were on the surface. Uh, Julian of Norwich uses this analogy, like when you're on the surface of the ocean and you're going through normal life. I mean, the good things, the bad things, what you encounter, and so forth, but you're seeking God. And then suddenly something plunges you down into the depths where where suddenly you find yourself fully in that presence. And you don't remain there forever. You come back up to the surface, but it's like what's happening is that you're being absorbed by the oceanic love of God. And you get a taste of actually what will happen when you die. That you're going to be living there fully, but it breaks in small ways, but yet it breaks into this life and 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 allows you to rest there and to know beyond anything else you know in your head, to know that this is the deepest reality of your life.
I'm so grateful, Reverend Granberg-Michaelson, for your willingness to explore that with us, to recount that with us. That's a theme that you touch on, but only adjacent to you. You
Yeah.
give us a page description, but you don't go too far in that
Yeah.
unpacking that experience in this book. I'm very, very grateful for your statements here. If I can move us then to this second movement you described, from certainty to connection, I'd like to read again if I can. This is from page 86. You write this: whatever the cause, when you reach the point in your journey where your prior rational certainty about God and your convictions about faith feel annihilated, you have entered a hinge point in your life's journey. How you respond will be decisive for your future. I can affirm that yes, we are afraid of losing our certainties. I think that's a universal fear, whether we would put it in those words or not. But you tell us not that we shouldn't fear this, even though we do, because this is spiritually helpful and this is spiritual progress. Uh, how can that be?
I think, Jonathan, it can be by understanding that's how God works. And that's how God has always worked with God's people. Um, I mean, you even go back to the Old Testament, to the Hebrew scriptures. I mean, what in the world is happening with the children of God when they're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, when they do not know what is going on and whether this God of theirs can be trusted and what the outcome is going to be? Everything they thought was certain has been kind of destroyed, and all they're given is manna every day, enough to get by that day. I mean, I think even there you have an example of what it means for people who worship God to live in the midst of uncertainty. So I mean, I think this is common. I think we don't realize how common a part of Christian experience it is because we're so addicted to getting all the rational answers right and thinking that's the way we get the security we need. No, I think doubt is in fact a form that deepens faith. Um, and even the word belief, when you go back to the Greek, as you probably know, that can get translated as much as trust. We tend to think of belief as the creed, as the right things, as getting these right rational propositions. Well, I think the depth of faith calls us into a transcendent kind of experience that that rivets our certainty in a different way. A lot of evangelicals, I mean, there's a whole mini industry now of ex-evangelicals who are trying to deal with the deconstruction of their faith and trying to figure out how you put things back together. The same thing for those who are raised Catholic or those who are raised in other parts of Christian tradition. Things disillusion them, and they have all kinds of doubts. And sometimes even theological education is really good at breaking down people's past assumptions, but isn't quite as good as putting it back together into a into a more coherent way. So, uh, I mean, the framework of our life as Christians is from birth, life to death to resurrection. And I think that pattern comes out even in how we deal with former rational certainty, moving to deeper ways of our certainty.
Sometimes the problem is losing our certainties and not knowing how to respond. Sometimes the
Yep.
problem is having a discussion with someone who's very certain of the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And as our society has really been grappling with polarization of the
Yep.
last few years, what's your advice when you're in a spiritual conversation or an exchange with someone who's very certain of an opinion that you're pretty sure is not correct?
Well, I think I've learned that you don't you don't argue people intellectually out of a difference of opinion that you have. You can, I mean, you could, share your own point of view, but people come to these certainties for reasons that are usually not rational. I mean, they're coming to them out of their own journey. I think it's really interesting that, uh, you know, some people cling to certainties uh, because they need that, because they haven't dealt with other things in their life and their spiritual journey as deeply. So I find it's much more interesting to ask someone to tell me their story. Tell me, how is it, that you got to this place? What led you? Where along the way? And where can I find points where I can identify with, well, yeah, I get that. That's similar to something that I experienced. Now, here here then are kind of the questions that came to me. I wonder if those questions have ever come to you.
Reverend Granberg-Michaelson, the third movement that you describe here is from grandiosity to authenticity.
Hmm.
And as you describe this movement, you use the Enneagram to unpack what
Yeah.
you mean. You self disclose that you are a three on the Enneagram. I happen to also self identify as a three, so I was riveted when you started talking about this. But I'm wondering, so the threes on the Enneagram, those are the folks who really care about the way that others perceive them. They're very motivated to win other people's approvals. But is grandiosity a spiritual pitfall for all personality types equally, or are some of us more prone to what this pitfall you're describing?
That's a great question. I think some of us are more prone. I think the way we're wired means we have uh, different areas that we have to be particularly alert to. I happen to find tools like the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs, so forth. I just find them helpful in helping to figure out how we're wired. I mean, none of them are infallible, but they can be useful tools that can be used in our process of figuring out how God has made us. And yeah, the Enneagram, um, in any of these things, there are certain qualities about, like, you're an Enneagram 3. Well, it means you know how to tell a story well. It means you know how to convince others. It means you know how to inspire. You know how to paint a really compelling picture. So, an Enneagram 3 can be a good used car salesman. An Enneagram 3 can be a good leader of an organization. An Enneagram 3 can be a good new church start pastor. I mean, there are certain things that fit, but the danger is that an Enneagram 3 won't tell the whole story, that the Enneagram 3 will put forward only those things that kind of present the best picture, and they'll engage in what you could call impression management. You'll always want to be attentive to how are others perceiving you, and when that becomes really grandiose in a narcissistic way, you're pushing down and eliminating all those parts of yourself that are also real, but you don't want to deal with it. You don't want anyone else to know. And what happens eventually is that some of that will leak out, or it will cause you such an inherent kind of contradiction. You begin to know that you're not really telling all the truth, that you begin to lose your own confidence, or you turn to things to sort of satisfy your insecurity. So that, I mean, for an Enneagram 3, I think that's uh, the challenge is to avoid deceit, avoid presenting either yourself or presenting something that you're selling, that you want to call people to, uh, presenting it in a way that simply doesn't tell the whole truth. God, God wants the whole truth revealed, all it, and that's finally what liberates us. And that so that like with any of these Enneagram types, any of these personality things, there are things that are real gifts of God, but with that comes what you could call the shadow side, the side that reveals also your vulnerability.
Final movement that you describe in your book, The Soul Work of Justice, is from control to trust. You introduce this with an unforgettable line from a poet that you've read by the name of David
Yeah,
White.
yeah.
The phrase is, "What you can plan is too small for you to live." And I think a lot of us intuit the truth of what White is getting at here. But then if plans that we make are too small to live, what is your advice to leaders concerning planning? Should we do it at all? And if so, for what purpose?
If you're a leader, um, and you've got a board, you've got an organization, a church, whatever, there'll be times when people will say, well, we need a strategic plan. We need a mission and a vision and a strategic plan. I've been through, I don't know, either as an executive or as a board member, more strategic planning processes than I'd like to admit. And I don't want to do any more. You know, um, it's that kind of thing is necessary because you got to have some way of figuring out how are you going to allocate resources and priorities and so forth. But I think, Jonathan, we vastly overrate our ability to plan and control outcomes. Um, and what I say in the book, I mean, there are three simple things that I just throw out. COVID, which I mean, there are in the United States, there are probably 350,000 congregations. COVID destroyed the plans of every single one of them, you know, in a totally unexpected way. And they had to cope with what do we do now that wasn't going to rely on some document sitting on their shelf. It was going to rely on how do we become resilient? How do we respond to what God has put forward to us at this moment? Or, gee, we just got to retreat back into something we think is safe. It was the same way with the murder of George Floyd and all of the ripple effects that happened, and how we deal with questions of race and how we deal with all that legacy, and then a backlash against that, what affected all kinds of organizations. And part of the world where I live in Santa Fe, a couple years ago, we had a forest fire that was the worst in the state, and it scrambled the plans of the whole state government as well as all kinds of organizations. And so my point in that is that, yeah, you got to do planning, but you have to also realize that what's going to become most important, especially in the day and age in which we live, our capacity to build internal resilience and to build the kind of readiness to adjust and respond to things that come across our path that we didn't expect or plan for, and to see those as opportunity. And I think this all has a great spiritual meaning for our own individual lives, because I think it's the same in our own lives. And the theological concept that comes into play here is grace. And grace not as some doctrine in the head, or not as grace, not as some reason that evangelicals cite to explain why they're not Catholic, but grace that is a lived experience where you depend on 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 God's unexpected presence that comes as gift and comes as opportunity in ways that allow you to take the next step forward.
We're extremely grateful that we've been able to speak with you, Reverend Granberg-Michaelson. Thanks so much for writing this book, The Soul Work of Justice, Four Movements of Contemplative Action. As I said, this is a book that I needed to read, not just one that I got to read. And I can highly recommend this book. If you are speaking to the world now, if you're doing anything where you're trying to make a difference and where you want your work to overcome obstacles, you're going to need spiritual resources, and Wes's book outlines those in a really moving way. So I'm really, really grateful for this book. You, sir, have another. I happen to know that you have another appointment today. You have a wonderful French cafe to get to, but I can't resist asking, do I see a picture of you and the Pope in the background in your office?
Yes, you do.
I thought I might. Can you share a story before we let you go?
That particular picture was when Pope Benedict visited the United States, and I was head of my denomination and had helped put Christian churches together. And Pope Benedict visited, and there were a group of people whom he wanted to meet, and I was fortunate enough to be one of them. And someone took a picture. So that's, sometimes those things happen when you're in these positions. And yeah, I do put it up on the wall. I've also got a picture there above it of my time when
Hmm,
I had the privilege of meeting Nelson Mandela when I was with the
no
World
kidding.
Council of Churches. I probably would regard the meeting with Mandela a little more moving than the meeting. Well, not more moving, but well, I just like the fact that I was able to meet Mandela, and I was grateful I was able to meet Pope Benedict. I wish I had met Pope Francis, never had. I'm going to be in Rome in April with the Global Christian Forum, and we'll probably have a time to meet with Pope Leo, so that'll be a pleasure.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you, sir, so much for your honesty, candor, and openness in this book. Thank you so much for your generosity of time today, and hope you have a wonderful morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan, and bless you in your ministry and your journey. So grateful for what you're doing and for the connection we've had.